when we look at the privatization of water, how does that impact communities and women in particular? So we're looking at sort of corporations coming into communities that say, this is our water, and people of that community and women in particular who are often charged with collecting that water and may not have easy access to potable water, to now have to travel great distances with the hopes that they're getting water that they can bring back to their families. In particular, for those communities that don't have means, for example, to collect rainwater or other means of potable water. And so when we look at the ways in which women are impacted, their labor in particular, and perhaps even exploitation of that labor and not understanding what it takes physically to collect that water and then bring it back to the communities for hygiene, for cooking, perhaps for farming. And then how does that impact their families and their communities? If they're worried about their water, that may impact their healthcare or lack thereof if they don't have access to water. If they're not healthy, they're not able to get the education they need to empower their communities. And so when it's women oftentimes in rural communities that have to do that collection and we're not connecting those dots, we don't realize, for example, the disparate impact of women. I grew up in California. And a lot of the farming and the produce that is done in California actually spreads out to the rest of the country. And I also, lived most recently in San Francisco before moving here to Providence. And I noticed that the big thing in the Bay Area was going to Napa for the weekend, this romanticized notion of what it meant to go to the wineries. But then I look at who's farming those lands and whose labor and backs are toiled for the production of that wine, for the production of that food. While the majority of the numbers are indeed men, we know that women in particular are vulnerable in these communities, particularly if they're working in larger sheds or living in larger sheds rather, and their living conditions may not be necessarily stellar. So women in particular are vulnerable in those spaces, both because numerically they're smaller, but also they're more vulnerable to issues related to abuse and perhaps even sexual abuse and harassment. Then we have the children involved. And when we think about how gender is stratified within the United States, we still, even if we have dual career couples in a heterosexual couple, it's still primarily women who are still charged with the nurturing of their families. So I think about the toil and the labor of women, farm workers, the campesinas, for example, who are working in those farms, working in those wineries, collecting that food and still charged with making sure that their families are taken care of and that there's food on the table. And so when I look at climate, I also think about, farming, the farming industry and the impact that has. I would drive through the cattle ranches. I would drive through the farming. I would drive through side of the road stands. I would see all this. I would see who was working the fields. I would see who was purchasing the produce. It didn't look like people who were working the fields. So they didn't even get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I think about my own experience, and actually the painting behind me depicts a Filipino value called bayanihan. And it's a painting of a village coming together to actually carry a neighbor's hut from one part of the village to another. That's often during rainy season. So actually moving the hut on bamboo poles on top of the shoulders of men, particularly from the ocean to inland, right, to protect them from the monsoons. It's a sense of social responsibility, doing for one's neighbor. It was everyday life in the way in which my family and community had ubiquitous messages of what it meant to have a sense of social responsibility, to have an ethic of care for people within the community that extended beyond my immediate family. But how do we have a sense of social responsibility and understand how our individual actions can make a huge difference in our community? We can talk about issues of climate from a very academic and scholarly perspective, but what's important to note is the people on the ground. How is this going to impact the day-to-day lives of the mothers who still have to put food on their table and to ensure that their families are taken care of and that they have access to healthy food and have access to education and healthcare? As we think about a community of learned people, formally educated people, to also understand the impact it has at the very basic unit, the family, the ways in which we can translate information that's very intellectual, again, can become this sort of exercise of exploring various options and people who choose to be activists, but to understand how that impacts people in their day-to-day lives.